Okay, the mic is on. Please take your seats and remember to save room for the latecomers. Even though you're here first and you got a good seat, make sure you allow room for other people to sit down as they straggle in. We are going to start. Our panel is queued up and ready to go. And I just want to give one caveat before I introduce this panel, and that is that in the energy world, like in a lot of technical worlds, there's a lot of acronyms, right? And so we didn't come up, we don't have a acronym busting sign or anything like that, but please do your best to avoid using acronyms because not everybody knows what every initial stands for. We'd appreciate that. Do your best. All right, let's get started. I'm really excited about this panel. Anybody who knows me well has heard me say many times that policy matters. It matters a lot. And of course, as a former policy maker, I sure hope it mattered. But we know when we're trying to move complex systems forward to the future, state policymakers and federal policymakers play a critical role to make sure that we establish policy certainty and clear guidance and allow the security that investors need to be able to develop a new technology and innovation to flourish. We've heard a lot about innovation already today. So I am delighted to have some very smart people here today with us in the policy landscape who will talk all about that, but they only have 55 minutes. So here we go, and I will turn it over to our moderator, Senior Attorney of Environmental Law and Policy Center, Brad Klein. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ellen. I'm really excited to be here. I think this is going to be a great panel. Thanks much, Ellen, Barb, whole staff at the Energy Transitions Lab. This has been just an outstanding conference. And so it feels like 2017, and working on energy and utility policy for the last several years, 2017 is different. It feels like there's kind of a great awakening around storage. It's part of the conversation in so many ways that it hasn't been before. And, but I think we're at this moment where it's now permeated a lot of what we hear about energy, but it doesn't feel like we really know what to do about it yet. And so I think state policy in this panel is going to really try to identify some of the things that states can do, what they should be doing, and we fortunately have just a terrific expert panel that I think can give the national, regional, and really local viewpoint on some of these questions. So we have Brett Simon here from GTM Research. He's the energy storage analyst there and has done a lot of research into state policies nationwide. Dave Kolata is here. He's the executive director at the Citizens Utility Board in Illinois. Dave since 2005 or 7, yep. And have worked for years with Dave and his organization. They do terrific work in Illinois and now have recently opened an office here in Minnesota. And then Bill Grant, the Deputy Commissioner for the Division of Energy Resources at the Minnesota Department of Commerce. And Bill and his office are really integrally involved in all things energy in the state, overseeing utility planning and advocacy. And then in prior roles, Bill led energy work at the Isaac Walton League. So I think with this mix of backgrounds and experience, we're going to get a really terrific overview of state policy and what states can be doing on energy storage. So each panelist is going to give 5 to 10 minute opening remarks. Then we'll come back and sit down and have some discussion. Please be thinking about questions, passing in cards, and I'll ask some audience questions as well. And without further ado, I want to call on Brett to give his presentation. And one thing to kind of try to work into your remarks for all three of you, I guess, is if you could think about, from your perspective, what's really the most interesting or encouraging or surprising or unexpected thing about energy storage over the last 12 months. You can kind of think about that a little bit from you personally. But Brett, thanks very much.
Take the podium?
I think wherever you're comfortable. You could sit here or you could take the podium.
I'll take the podium so I can see my slides. Hello, everyone. My name is Brett Simon. I'm an energy storage analyst at GTM Research, and very excited today to present to you on energy storage policy. So I'll be giving kind of the high-level overview of some of the policy themes we've seen in the United States over the last probably year to year and a half or so. So I've broken it up into two sections. The first section is looking at behind the meter, so customer cited, whether that's commercial and industrial, military, religious, or residential policy. And then the second section will look more at front of the meter, so just distribution and transmission cited storage systems. So our first theme that constantly comes up is reforms of both electricity rates and net energy metering. So this is quite important for behind the meter systems. In the case of net energy metering reform, across the US, we're seeing conversations happening about net energy metering. Should it continue? If not, should it be taken away entirely? Should it be changed? Kind of one of the examples of this is what happened in Hawaii last year, where the standard net energy metering program was ended, and it was split then for new customers for solar into two options: customer grid supply, where solar export was allowed, and customer self-supply with a zero export rule, in which case storage is effectively necessary in order to self-consume from your solar system. In terms of rate reforms, we're seeing some common themes where utilities are looking at implementing time of use rates, in which case storage can be employed to charge during the off-peak periods and discharge during peak periods. And in some cases for residential rates specifically, we're seeing the introduction of demand charges. Demand charges are fairly standard for commercial industrial customers, and in some cases can make up to around 40% or even some cases 50% of their monthly electric bill. And we're starting to see these types of charges being rolled out for residential customers. This is happening in places like Arizona, though still not at a grand scale. The second theme I'd like to touch on is some grid service pilots and incentives. So a number of states are looking at ways to employ behind-the-meter storage to provide different grid services. A few of these states are no surprise to most people. New York with programs like their BQDM, or California with programs, I said BQDM, that's an acronym, Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Program. I caught myself. And then California has a number of programs as well, things like the Preferred Resources Pilot or the Local Capacity Requirements Program that look to employ behind-the-meter storage for a suite of services on the grid. A few that might stand out and be a little surprising are the likes of Kentucky, where Glasgow EPB, the Electric Plant Board, has implemented a program of standalone residential storage of both battery storage and hot water heaters to see what kind of value it can provide. Next theme is states looking at resiliency programs. So we've heard resilience touched on, and even more today, quite a bit mentioned in the cases of Harvey and Irma. So resilience is, of course, something that's quite important. Has a lot of focus in the Northeast, particularly in states like New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut that were impacted by Hurricane Sandy some years ago. But with the advent of more hurricanes, I wouldn't be surprised if more policy for storage erupts in other parts of the U.S. In terms of resiliency. In fact, New Jersey has a program, the Renewable Electric Storage Incentive Program, that seeks to incentivize storage specifically for resilient infrastructure, places like hospitals, fire stations, police stations. And lastly, aggregation. This kind of goes back to some of the grid service points that I made earlier, but here again, looking at ways that we can aggregate behind-the-meter storage to provide different services for the grid and then ultimately provide value both for the electric grid as well as for the end customers. Next, I'll touch on front-of-the-meter policy. So again, this is storage cited on the distribution and transmission grid. Now, energy storage mandates are something that has been a big nudge for storage, particularly in California, over the last few years. So I'm sure most people in the room are familiar with AB 2514, California's bill that mandates 1.3 gigawatts of storage procurement by 2020, and those procurements have been ongoing. But there have been a few other states that have moved in this direction, one being Oregon with a much smaller mandate of 5 megawatt hours, and recently Massachusetts with a 200 megawatt hour mandate. So that's, more states are moving into this way. And in particular, we've also seen legislation introduced in a few other states towards this end, like Nevada and New York. So grid modernization programs, this this factors a lot into some of the earlier points that Kelly Speaks-Bachman made in terms of utility IRPs. So more and more we are seeing utilities across the US include storage in their long-term resource planning. Across the country we're seeing, rather than storage being cited as just a nice to have, utilities actually including specific capacities of storage in their longer-term resource planning. And this is great for the industry because it speaks both to, the value of storage as well as giving, kind of a clear roadmap for actual storage deployment that's going to come online and can provide learnings for the entire industry. Utility RFPs and RFOs are similar to IRPs in that they look at procuring storage to fulfill needs on the electric grid. But the difference is that RFOs and RFPs, requests for proposals and requests for offers, generally have a much shorter time frame, whereas IRPs are looking, 10, 15, 20, sometimes even 30 years out. These RFOs and RFPs generally are looking shorter term, more in the kind of 3 to 7 year space. We're seeing this a lot of cases with utilities looking for non-wires alternatives and including storage and an option for those kinds of resources. Places like Long Island, where there are issues with capacity constraints or transmission constraints, are thinking about how to employ storage for these types of services. And so I would be remiss if I had a discussion of storage policy and I didn't talk about the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or a much shorter way to say it is the FERC NOPR. So the FERC NOPR was introduced last year to solicit comments to basically have the different ISOs and RTOs across the country think about how storage can be properly valued and be allowed to provide services that it is technically capable of providing. Sadly, the process was stymied by the fact that FERC did not have a quorum until recently, and it seems unlikely that the process will move forward in the near future, given that FERC has just reached a quorum. But nevertheless, the FERC NOPR is something to keep an eye on because, as comments are reviewed by the new members of FERC and the commission, makes some decisions, there ultimately might be a rulemaking that is issued, which then would direct ISOs and RTOs to investigate how storage is currently being accounted for on the grid, and then in the future think about ways that storage can be properly compensated for the abilities or for the services that it is technically capable of providing. So in the long term, the FERC NOPR can have some very large implications for storage in ISO and RTO markets. And with that, I'd like to thank you and pass it over to my next colleague.
Great. Thank you, Brett.
Thank you, everyone. My name is David Kolata. I'm the Executive Director of the Citizens Utility Board of Illinois. I'm also on the board of CUB Minnesota, and we're very proud to have helped incubate that organization and with the job that Annie and her team at CUB Minnesota are doing. Very proud of that, and it's been a fantastic experience. At CUB, our #1 policy priority for at least a decade now has been maximizing cost-effective distributed energy resources. Starting with energy efficiency and demand response, these are our cleanest resources. They're also our cheapest resources. And when we modeled out potential futures on what was going to be in the best interest of consumers, we realized pretty quickly that distributed energy resources need to play a key role. And so we've been working on that, starting with EE, starting with demand response, moving to solar as the cost curve came down and new business models opened up. So when it comes to storage, we're actually quite bullish at this point. Now, we're not naively bullish in the sense that it's not cost effective in many circumstances now, but it is in some. And that declining cost curve is really of tremendous importance, because if that continues, and I think there's every evidence that it will continue, it's going to be really disruptive for the energy space. Not all disruption is good disruption. I don't want to make a Silicon Valley, let's just disrupt stuff to disrupt stuff, but I do think that storage and cost-effective storage will play a very important role going forward, and will inexorably lead to having to rethink the utility business model. So we are bullish about that. At the end of the day, we see several different types of potential consumer benefits. First, and this is a very important one that's cost effective right now, is lower market costs. And the example of that I would give is frequency regulation. If you look at your the guidebook that was handed out, you'll notice that Illinois has a lot of circles. We've got over 150 megawatts of storage now. That all came on really in the last year and a half. That's a very promising trend to get to Brad's point. To the best of my knowledge, all of that is providing frequency regulation, responding quicker and cheaper than traditional resources that we're doing that. That's of very much importance going forward, because the way the world is playing out, at least in Illinois, we're going to see, I think, there may be some countervailing trends, but we're going to see energy and capacity prices continue to trend towards zero. They won't be actually zero, but they'll be moving in that direction if current trends hold. But it moves the pricing pressures to the ancillary services side. It moves it to the distribution side of the grid. So the fact that storage is already cost effective, providing that role, I think is very important. There's also, of course, deferred T&D or capacity investments, reduced cost of renewables integration, which several of speakers today have talked about, increased grid flexibility and reliability, and that, last but certainly not least, reduced peak demand. I think this is something that we've been emphasizing for years. There's really nothing more important from a consumer point of view than reducing peak demand. The image I often used, the politics behind this are a little bit odd in the sense that it was funded by Exxon, which is probably the oil and natural gas element of it. But traditionally, you have to balance supply and demand at every hour of every day. And the costs of meeting peak demand are enormously high. But they're not that many hours. We're going to be releasing a study now in a couple of weeks. We've been looking at real ComEd anonymous energy usage data. And what we found is that in 2016, 94% of ComEd customers would have been better off on real-time pricing, real-time PJM market price. 94% would have been better off. The top 5% of structural savers would have saved $30 a month over the course of the year. Now, the reason why more people don't sign up for real-time pricing, I think, is sort of the fear of the black swan. Certainly, if you went back and ran the numbers during the polar vortex, I'm sure it would look different. But when we looked at the number of hours that were actually at issue, we're talking 30 or 40 over the course of a year. There is a business model in there where storage can help essentially lower risk premium of average pricing. And we're very encouraged by that. It's something else that I think ultimately gets to some of the state public policy questions. I would completely agree. Several speakers have made this point about the need to stack values. Storage bridges the sort of traditional generation T&D divide. It can provide many different types of services. You have to make sure that you're doing this fairly for consumers and that you're being double paid. But to the extent that you can provide different services and you compete for those, you should be compensated for that. And that's going to be increasingly important for something like storage. I think the direction that Illinois is probably headed is a grid value approach where we kind of disaggregate storage for the distribution side services. In our bill that we just passed a couple months ago, or about a year ago now, the Future Energy Jobs Act, we move in the direction of a value of distributed energy resources rebate tied to a smart inverter. I think at the start that's purely going to be solar, but I suspect, and I think we'll have conversations over the next year and a half as we move forward with our next grid utility of the future process, that will open that up to storage as well. We have to figure out the right way to do it. It's not easy to quantify the grid value of storage, but we know that it's there, and certainly we think that it should compete. And the fact that it can provide potentially a good hedge on the retail side is another value that is certainly there. Interconnection rules are obviously a big thing. We've taken some steps in Illinois to address those. Brad has done great work on that. I think there's certainly some issues there as well that we'll need to work out. The third-party role and competition will clearly be a huge issue everywhere, especially in a state like Illinois that is restructured. There will be a debate about, well, should the utility be able to own storage? Should it all be the third party? I can tell you my own view is I'm agnostic on this. I think that there should be competition. I'm not opposed to the utility owning as long as it's cost-effective and it's not excluding others. But there are complicated issues because ultimately, when you're talking about the distribution side of the grid, the utility is going to have to be involved. So the question is, when a utility is facilitating a service, how essentially does it get compensated for that? Solvable, but difficult issues that we'll need to work through. The last thing, and storage eligibility, is we want to make sure that storage is not pigeonholed into one bucket, that it is eligible to compete. It may not win, but it certainly should be eligible to compete to provide various services. And then lastly, this gets back to the disruption theme. I do want to mention that, my own view, and this may not come to pass, but that I do think, and maybe even more so in a vertically integrated state, that load defection, if we don't get ahead of the storage issue, could be a problem. At some point, if the cost curve keeps coming down, it is going to be economically feasible for a large customer, be it a Google or an Amazon, folks who want to be 100% renewable. It is going to be feasible for them to leave the grid. I think RMI has done some very good work on this. That starts a chain reaction, and you can manage that with special rates to a certain extent. But even that, there's an issue of the unraveling the onion. And if you look at the history of Illinois, the main driver why we ended up with electric restructuring was nuclear plant cost overruns. But certainly part of the story was ultimately trying to manage that through special rates, and then it became untenable. I say all of this just because disruption can go both ways, and I do think it's important that states take a leadership role to really look at this issue and figure out how to reform the utility business model to make the whole system work so we can take advantage of what I think is a very promising and a cost-effective future. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. That was terrific. Really good overview. Now to Bill Grant.
Thanks very much, and really appreciate being here today. I've had my head buried in crude oil pipeline issues for the last seemingly forever, and I can't tell you how much more interesting and rewarding it is to be spending time on an emerging technology that I think really holds a great deal of promise going forward versus one arguably nearing the end of its useful life. So thanks very much for that. What I want to do is quickly talk about some of the initial study work that we've done at the Department of Commerce and what we see as some of the future opportunities coming out of that. We want to talk about the work that we've done and are doing now on looking at a path to 10% solar by 2030 in Minnesota, and the role energy storage hopefully will play in that. And then finally, a lot of speakers have already touched on resource planning issues. I want to bring that down to the Minnesota level and talk a little bit about implications for our state. First, the energy storage study. Now, this was done and completed in January of 2014. So a lot of the price assumptions about storage, of course, are now quite outdated. But I think some of the work that was done there, investigating the potential costs and benefits of installing utility-managed grid-connected energy storage devices in both residential and commercial settings in Minnesota, really added some value to the conversation and gave us some ideas about market niches that are, at least given those prices at that time, were worth studying, including things like using site-specific 15-minute data for various site profiles, the effect of the MISO ancillary services market rules, and how, if they were to change, storage might become a more interesting proposition. The declining cost of storage versus the expiration of the investment tax credit and the possible pairing with solar PV, and some of the combined value streams for peak shaving, ancillary services, and backup power. Clearly, this is a study that could be refreshed at this point with more recent data. And some of the areas that we see coming out of that study as potentially providing value include energy assurance, affordability, and economic efficiency and reliability. In the instance of energy assurance, an area of particular concern to us because the department also has responsibilities in Minnesota for assuring energy assurance across all of the energy streams that we use, and using energy storage as a backup for critical infrastructure, water supply and wastewater treatment facilities, for example, is something that I think is clearly worth further exploration. We were the lucky recipients of a US DOE Sunshot grant to look at how to achieve 10% solar acquisition by the year 2030 in Minnesota. And we're working with over 20 partners, including utilities, the solar industry, government agencies, various nonprofit groups, corporations, and all with the goal of looking at how do we achieve that overarching goal. And one of the least cost and best value strategies that we're looking at is the pairing of solar with energy storage. So that work has just begun several months ago, and over the next 3 years we'll be delving into this much more deeply, but we think there is a lot of promise there in that. And we're really doing the kind of scenario-based technical analysis that one would need to do in order to identify where those opportunities exist to complement solar in a future high penetration scenario. And it looks to us preliminarily like solar, storage rather, is one of the complementary technologies that can be and should be relied on in those high penetration scenarios. So more as we continue that work, and I know a number of you in this room are probably already involved, so thank you for your assistance with that. We're looking at a storage in the context of other technologies that we think are the emerging and growingly mature technologies that can be used in this marketplace. We've talked about a number of them already. Geographic dispersion is one of those that I think, given the concerns about the intermittent nature or the variable nature, as my friend John Dunlap would remind me to say, really deals with a lot of the variability issues and spread over a broad enough footprint can really help resolve some of those issues. And so we'll be looking at some very high penetration scenarios. It's a part of the Sunshot study, and again, look forward to those results. We've already mentioned that there are a lot of energy storage technologies. Some have been with us for a long time. Hydropower, of course, is probably the classic example. And as my friends from Manitoba Hydro like to remind me, one of the largest batteries in the world exists just over the border, beginning near Winnipeg, Lake Winnipeg. They are already providing utilities in Minnesota with storage like ancillary service offerings, and we expect that there will be more of that as time goes on. But obviously there are any number of technologies here that we include. I think it's tempting, given the recent price drops in the battery storage field and the flexibility that comes with battery storage. It's not site dependent as some of the other technologies, storage technologies are, that will really be the game-changing technology. But we should be reminded that there are a number of others, some already operating on the grid and others that we expect will play a larger role in the future. And this is probably a little bit difficult to see, but this just describes some of the various roles that storage is already playing or that it could play on the grid. And some of these are behind the meter, others are on the utility side of the meter, obviously. But a well-functioning grid will utilize all of these roles in meeting a cost-effective and reliable energy system. Minnesota already has some experience with solar, as can be seen from this map. The Connexus project that was mentioned earlier has been proposed, if it were to go in, would be the largest solar plus storage project in the Midwest. We're very excited about seeing that go forward, but as you can see, there are not a lot, but some other projects already up and operating. This database probably is not totally complete and certainly doesn't consider all of the storage devices that are already operating on the customer side of the meter. So some of this we've already talked about, types of storage that are already used in resource planning, and I want to talk a little bit about resource planning at this point. Utilities have to submit in Minnesota a 15-year integrated resource plan roughly every 2 years, and those resource plans generically identify resource needs in terms of their size, type, and timing. And that it would include, of course, supply-side resources as well as demand-side peaking and intermediate resources, and things that can be done on the rate design side to affect when load is occurring on the system. Upon approval, utilities typically initiate competitive bidding processes to acquire supply-side and demand-side resources, and we envision that energy storage at some point will be a part of those all-source bidding processes. This is one way, of course, of achieving price discovery in the market, but I think in order for storage to play a role on the bulk electricity side, we're also going to need to quantify its environmental benefits, its benefits in terms of flexibility and other aspects that give it an advantage when considering it as a resource type. I wanted to mention that, Claire Moeller's point earlier that the grid itself is probably our largest energy storage system here in the Midwest. And one of the arguments that I've heard consistently from legislative policymakers is that in order to achieve higher penetrations of renewable energy, we need storage to back up that intermittent resource. But of course, storage is too expensive, so really we should curb our enthusiasm about higher penetrations of renewables. I think that that's a specious argument, and one that as storage prices continue to fall will certainly fall with it, but it's one important thing to keep in mind as the policy debate around energy storage goes forward, is that that is still a very popular view amongst a number of policymakers. Obviously, from our perspective, storage provides peaking services, creates an increase in demand during the off-peak, but then it supplies during on-peak when we really need it. And as I mentioned before, our hope is that it will bid against traditional peaking units, and the benefits associated with storage technologies will be sussed out in those processes. So just to wrap up, we see a lot of potential for additional study on the topic of energy storage. It's clearly one pathway that we're exploring now to meet a 10% solar future. And energy storage, I think, will have an increasing role in resource planning done here in Minnesota and elsewhere. So with that, thanks very much.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks to all our panelists. We have about 18 minutes or so for discussion, so I'm just going to dive right in. I have a lot of questions. I'm sure you do too, so please fill out note cards and send them forward, and we'll just get through as many of these as we can. But I want to turn to you, Brett. You gave us a really good bird's eye view and themes of what's happening across the country in states. And I want to get really practical now. This is the state policy panel. What, in your opinion, is the first sort of best thing that a state can do, especially a state that hasn't considered storage, in a robust way yet? What would you recommend one or two of the very first things that states should be doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it would be a cop-out for me to say it depends on a state-by-state basis because, of course, you have to think about what is the state's electricity market? Is it part of an ISO or RTO? What is its generation mix? But if I had to say what has actually led to storage markets being built, I think one of the big ones is mandate, which we've seen in California, as well as programs that allow storage to supply services to the grid. So again, using California as an example, the Preferred Resources Pilot, the Local Capacity Requirements Program, and others have actually, and also the Demand Response Auction Mechanism, have actually been opportunities for storage to supply services, and thus, then you get financiers who will get behind these projects by saying, oh, we can actually expect a return because these projects will be receiving some sort of a capacity payment or some other sort of support, and thereby have, contracted, reliable revenue streams.
It's helpful. And just a quick follow-up. Is there a state that you think is just doing it right, that they've took the right first steps? Is there a really good model for other states to look at, or is that still sort of to be determined?
Yeah, it depends, and not every state is going on the same way. I mean, everyone talks about California and what they're doing is great. Another state that I think is worth keeping an eye on is Massachusetts. I'm not just saying that because I'm from Massachusetts or because the Patriots won the greatest Super Bowl in history, but all right, that joke played way better in New England. But Massachusetts has done a lot of work, particularly in the last year, to lay the groundwork for a storage market. So they had a major study, the State of Charge study, that looked at what value could storage provide to the grid in Massachusetts, what would be some optimal levels of storage to deploy. And using the State of Charge as a guideline, they're now starting to build out policy to support storage, whether it's the Advancing the Commonwealth Energy Storage Program, ACES, which looks to procure storage to supply grid services, whether it's some changes to their net metering program, which is going to include incentives for storage, whether it's the new storage mandate that gives a clear target within the state to achieve by 2020. I think Massachusetts is a state that is well worth watching over the next few years because they've already laid the groundwork to build a rather robust market.
Thank you. Dave, I know in your role at CUB, there are many opportunities where CUB is engaging with a utility or with other stakeholders to look at different types of pilots, whether it's rate design or technologies on the grid. And we heard some discussion about pilots today. From your position, how would you sort of examine different kind of pilot proposals to discern what are good features of pilots and bad, and what would you want to learn from them? For states or utilities that are thinking about piloting some of this, what would be your perspective on how to design a really well-functioning pilot?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if I had to boil it down to one thing, it would be including a performance metric aspect to it. In other words, track exactly what you're getting at. I think for a consumer advocate perspective, and although we are generally pro-grid modernization and we see very much the potential value of that, we're always a little bit concerned, especially given who owns our main utilities, that the maximization won't occur because it'll be a problem for the generation company, for example. So I think there's this question of what's gold plating and what's not. And I think the best way to handle that is to simply have strict performance metrics where you tie cost recovery to achieving known objectives along the lines of improving load shape or reducing peak demand. So be very clear in what you're trying to achieve and what you're testing, and have performance metrics associated with that. I would add that have a plan for scalability as well. I don't think that, and it's okay to fail, but ultimately just doing a one-off pilot that can't go anywhere, I think that the value of that is, I wouldn't say it's zero, but it's not all that valuable.
Yeah, it would be stranded value, as Kelly, Kelly mentioned. So Bill, you know, your office, and you in particular, and others on your staff, spent a lot of time a few years ago developing a methodology for the value of solar, trying to quantify that, looking at the features of that technology and the value it brings to the grid, and by extension to all customers on the grid. And we heard, you know, in Dave's and other presentation today about the trend or states that are thinking about value-based compensation for different resources, distributed resources, including storage. Having gone through the experience you did here in Minnesota to develop this methodology for solar, which I think everyone was really impressed with, and understanding that if this new sort of value-based mechanism came to Minnesota, it might fall on your lap or your department's lap in some way. What would you be either really concerned about or thinking about, or how would you attack that? I mean, I think it's hard, but I'm interested in how you would approach that kind of exercise.
Right. It isn't exactly the same exercise that we went through on value of solar, because that was clearly a supply-side resource with certain characteristics that were fairly consistent across all of the systems that we were seeing out there. So it was more possible, I think, to establish the various avoided costs associated with transmission, distribution, and the other components that we looked at. It's a trickier proposition, I think, with storage because it manifests itself in so many different ways, and both on the customer side of the meter and on the utility side potentially. And so I think we'd have to do a lot of thinking about whether or not that methodology would really be an appropriate starting point for valuing storage. And remember, the value of solar was really looking at the value of solar to the utility that was purchasing that solar. And so we'd have to do some hard thinking about whether or not it was a completely analogous situation. I'm not sure that it is.
I want to stick with that topic and maybe turn to Dave to mention the legislation that passed in Illinois and how you think the Illinois Commerce Commission might be trying to address this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Bill said. It is a complicated issue. I do think that in Illinois, as I mentioned, we have a value of distributed energy resources tariff, and by legislation, the Illinois Commerce Commission needs to start addressing that soon. And I suspect it will start as soon as 2018, really trying to get into, okay, how do we quantify the distribution side benefits of solar, but also I think batteries will be part of that. And you know, it won't be an easy thing to do, but I do think it's a necessary thing, and I think that it's where most of the action, I think, in Illinois will occur. And we're looking forward to it because I do think that there's a fair amount of value there, and it's just a matter of making sure the system that you set up is fair. We also, as a restructured state, we've got the, depending how you look at it, advantage or disadvantage, depending on your perspective. But there are you know, market revenues that storage can achieve beyond the distribution side. And we've seen that with the frequency regulation built storage already.
And then just real quickly on the same topic, is there another state we can copy?
Well, I've already said California and Massachusetts. A state that's taking a somewhat different tack that's worth looking at as well is New York. New York has had their Reforming the Energy Vision proceeding, which isn't obviously focused on storage. It's focused on overall just rejiggering their energy infrastructure and looking at transitioning utilities from simply selling electricity to kind of being platform providers and networks through which consumers can also trade and transact their own electricity long term. So I think New York is taking quite a different tack than some of these other states, whereas we've seen mandates put in place in places like California and Massachusetts. New York, in contrast, they did introduce a bill for a mandate, but it doesn't seem that it's going to pass. Instead, they're looking at ways that they can allow market mechanisms to let storage come in. So for instance, I'll go back to, during my presentation, I mentioned the Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Program. The city of New York wanted to defer a $1 billion substation upgrade. They didn't say we're going to do this through storage. They said we're going to take bids from a variety of resources and see if we can come in under this $1 billion upgrade that's necessary. And ultimately, the answer was yes. And a variety of resources were procured, solar, energy efficiency, demand response, but battery storage was a piece of that as well. So New York seems to be a state that's saying, let's look at the market and allow market mechanisms to dictate storage participation.
Thank you. About a couple questions from the audience, and this is a great question, I think, and it goes to something Kelly mentioned about pricing, and then also to the planning topic, Bill, that you presented and has come up in several presentations. The question is, as the Puente gas plant shows, storage prices are changing too fast for regulators to keep pace. How can we get the most up-to-date prices into the hands of PUCs and state agency staff? And I just add one, doing these kinds of forward-looking planning exercises. And that can be a question for you, Bill, as at a state agency, but also if the other panelists have some thoughts on how to do that.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, typically the way we go about that is through a competitive bidding exercise where we get price discovery. And I think we have done, rather than just looking at all resources, in which I think it would be difficult, even if it was designed to identify peaking resources, be difficult for storage today to play in that realm. But a storage-only RFP where we were able to identify prices for storage-only offerings would be an interesting way to identify prices that are current for commissions to be able to use. Now, I think you'd have to be very clear about how you were setting the boundary of what you meant by storage. As we've discussed, there are a lot of different ways to slice that orange, and a lot of things that are already out there performing the storage function that you would have to agree or disagree belong in the RFP process or not.
Great. And maybe quickly to Brett, thinking about forward planning, and I think that Kelly used the term forward pricing, that's done in the gas industry. We have a technology whose prices are changing rapidly. Are there any states that are addressing this both in the context of renewables, but also storage, and thinking about an IRP process and how to forecast those prices for the future when you're thinking about investments in long-lived utility infrastructure?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's any specific state agencies that are forecasting prices. I know that we, GTM Research, for example, we do have price forecasting that we undergo, and I know also a number of vendors and developers, when they're pitching projects, in some cases they will have a forward pricing curve that they'll offer. So if you look at, say, an LG or a Samsung or whatnot, which are battery vendors, they do have a forward price roadmap saying, depending on the delivery that you want of your battery and depending on the capacity of the system, we can offer a cost of the battery of X dollars per kilowatt hour.
Okay, good. Another audience question for Dave. Question about utility versus private capital in this area. Whose capital is most appropriate for the build-out of grid modernization? Either the wires and IT platform, the distributed resources on that platform, or what factors are important to consider when thinking about that?
Well, like I said in my comments, I'm somewhat agnostic on that. I do think that ultimately when you're talking about the distribution system, you're talking about the monopoly function that the utility provides. You can chip off certain pieces of it, I suppose, but at the end of the day, that's likely going to be a utility function, and we believe that the grid has value and will continue to have value for some time, largely because of the storage function that it serves. I think that ultimately it's what's in the best interest of consumers, what's going to be the most cost-effective way to get there. My own intuition is that these types of technological innovations are best done by third parties. That I wouldn't preclude the utility from competing in every circumstance, or maybe even any circumstance. But I do think that when you get down to the realistic economics and politics of it, you have to figure out a way for the utility to reform its business model. And then you start getting into questions of, okay, if they're facilitating something that a third party is doing, how do you get compensated? Brad, as you know, in the case of Illinois, you can put it in short that our distributed energy resources tariff, the utility turns that into a rate-based asset that they can earn a return on. But I think it is a central question of the utility of the future, and I wouldn't say that there's a hard and fast answer at this point.
Great. So I think we have 2 minutes, and in the final 2 minutes, just go to each of the panelists, I guess. If there's a single most important thing that you could, these are always tough questions, right? Sum it all up in one thing, but so maybe we won't put that much pressure, but what is one really important thing that you would recommend that storage enthusiasts could do to sort of clear the path for, state-level storage development?
Make sure that everyone knows current storage system pricing.
I would agree with that. Answering a little bit different question, what we're finding out with our data analysis is that the risk premium embedded in average rates, given the number of hours, is really, really, really high. What we haven't seen in restructured states is the competitive retail market provide any real value, especially for residential and small business customers. I think that there is something there at the end of the day that storage can contribute to, and I would encourage folks to look at that, especially with all the data we're going to be having available in Illinois soon.
I'd go to the point that Ellen made earlier, that policy is, for an emerging technology like this, is key to the future success of the technology. And it's not enough just to be a true believer in your own technology. You have to have the broader view of what policies are going to need to be in place in order to create those initial openings for the technology. And having a presence on the ground, if it's a state that you intend to be competitive in and active in, there's no substitute for that.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking our terrific panel. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. That was fantastic, very illuminating. And I have to say, on behalf of the chair of the Board of Regents, David McMillan, that he would be happy to hear what you said, Bill, about Manitoba Power, which he did remind me of, that it's kind of the biggest storage thermal mass that we've got going, and he wanted to be here today, but he couldn't. He's also in his other life of senior executive at Minnesota Power. So we miss him being here. Anyway, thank you for that excellent overview, and I hope all of you on that panel can stay for as long as possible so people can catch up with you over the lunch hour and the reception.